politics now, and the focus today, for the past few days, has been a lot of focus on this one family trying to be able to stay in Australia. It's a Tamil family from Sri Lanka. So far, we don't have much sympathy from the government, perhaps some sympathy at least for the individual case, but no one changing their mind over this. It appears to boil down basically to this. The government is saying this family and all the decisions made so far, including in the courts, that they are not found to be refugees, and as a result, despite a long process that has meant they've been in Queensland, in Biloela, settling in that community, working as well and having children, they will be sent back to Sri Lanka because there is no risk to their safety. Advocates claim that that hasn't been properly assessed and this is still playing out in the courts, but the indication is from the government, very strong indication for the Prime Minister today, that assuming that they don't get cut off in the courts, the government will not be changing its mind on this, despite some very public pleas being made at the moment from advocates, and Barnaby Joyce joining his voice to that this morning as well. This was Scott Morrison asked at a news conference on whether or not he would possibly change his mind given all the sympathy that's come in for this family.
They remain very difficult decisions and they're not taken easily. And that's why it's important that we have to continue on with the very successful program that we've had, because I know what happens when people forget. I know what happens when people think it's okay to make an exception here or there. I remember what happened. I remember the deaths. I remember those terrible images, and I will never allow that to happen again if it's within my power. And where it's within my power, they are the decisions my government takes.
So this is where the government has gone on this. As soon as they're asked to give an opinion and for perhaps to express sympathy for this particular family situation, even to talk about whether or not this is the right type of family for Australia that are having a go in the vernacular of some, they go back to what they perceive is incentive for people to try to get on boats and come to Australia if this type of case is something the government turns on. Now, we know with these types of cases what often happens is they're quietly resettled. Clearly, that's not going to happen in this case now, given all the media attention around this. Scott Morrison says this is not about reading the public mood.
It's not about the public mood. It's about what is the right decision in Australia's national interests to ensure that the integrity of our border protection regime is maintained. Because just like when Kevin Rudd thought it was all right to get rid of temporary protection visas in August of 2008, and then 50,000 people turned up on 800 boats and 1,200 people died, I'm sure he felt that it might have been the humane thing to do.
Labor is continuing to make the case, though, and earlier I spoke to the Shadow Home Affairs Minister, Kristina Keneally.
His family was allowed to stay in Australia for a number of years, and that's partly because the Department of Home Affairs under Peter Dutton has really lost control of processing times. It can take up to 4 years to get an asylum claim assessed now, 2 years for a spouse visa. The blowout in waiting times is something that's been the subject of Auditor General reports as well, quite damning criticism from the Auditor General. But with this family too, they have been allowed to settle in Biloela, to put down roots, get jobs, volunteer, become part of the fabric of that community, start their family, and the Biloela community has embraced this family and is calling for them to say, and you know, in Tom, in a democracy, the government are responsive to the people. And in this case, the Australian people are speaking loudly right across this country that they want this family to stay.
In that circumstance, though, if you're saying it should be up to what the people think, I mean, you could highlight a whole lot of different families, couldn't you? And on each individual one, people might say, have compassion, let them stay. But how would that work as a policy?
In this circumstance, Tom, what we have is a Tamil family where there is some risk. The UN is advising to return Tamils to Sri Lanka. There is discretion in the Migration Act precisely for these types of circumstances. And there is something that you might call the moral duty of time. That is that because they have been allowed to stay here for so long, because the Department of Home Affairs isn't able to process applications conditions efficiently, that this family has been allowed to create roots and to contribute. And they are contributing. You know, they're working, paying taxes, being part of the local community, doing what migrants to Australia have done for decades, which is to put down roots and to contribute and become part of this Australian community.
Do you think or have any evidence that the family would be unsafe if they were returned to Sri Lanka?
There is advice from the United Nations about the perils and the risks for Tamils in Sri Lanka right now. And there is some argument as to whether or not the court has been able to properly assess that information. But again, Tom, we build the ministerial discretion into the Migration Act precisely for circumstances like this.
But as for that information, whether this specific family would be unsafe, do you have that knowledge? Have you asked the minister for information about this particular family's safety?
I've asked the minister. I have asked the minister on multiple occasions for information. Both myself directly and my office have had probably now close to a dozen requests to the minister's office for information, and none has been forthcoming. And I think for Minister Coleman, there is a failure of leadership here. He is the Minister for Immigration. This is his responsibility. This is his decision. He has vacated the space. And I think it is an indictment on his performance that he has failed not only to exercise discretion in this case, but he has failed to show leadership by fronting the Australian people and explaining himself.
You mentioned the general issue with safety of Tamils in Sri Lanka. Does that mean you'd make the case for the other 1,800 that have been returned, that they should be allowed back to Australia?
These are circumstances that need to be determined on their merits, Tom. And what I am arguing with this family, the merits of their circumstances merit ministerial intervention and the discretion that the Act allows.
But so that merit, what is that based on specifically other than the time they've been here? Because
this family has been allowed to become part of the Australian community. This family do have clear fears themselves for their safety if they are returned. And I know from the information that their legal representatives are providing is that the court, in their view, has not been able to properly assess or access all of that information. Again, Tom, this is a case that has been allowed to drag on for months and months and months and years, in fact. And the minister could have put all this to an end some time ago by simply taking the decision that it was in the best interest of Biloela, of Australia and of this particular family to allow them to stay.
But on that merit argument, the difference between this family, the differences we know about between this family and the other 1,800 Tamils that are returned, you're saying it's not a difference of their safety, but a difference of how long they've been here, so then they should be allowed to stay.
Tom, what I'm saying is that each of these cases need to be determined on their own individual merits. I am not arguing here for an undermining or overturning of the Migration Act. I'm asking for it to be applied. I'm asking for the Act to be applied because it does allow for ministerial discretion. And in this circumstance, where we have seen Peter Dutton take decisions before to allow 2 au pairs to come into the country, to allow a young man who is being held in Nauru, in the offshore processing centre there, to come to Australia to be joined with his family here. The minister has taken these decisions before. The Migration Act has remained intact. And in this circumstance, when we have the strong outpouring of support from the Biloela community, from regional Queensland, from a wide range of people across the political spectrum, Alan Jones, Barnaby Joyce, Craig Foster, and the quite frankly, thousands of people who turned up yesterday to rally behind this family. This is an opportunity for the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, to show real leadership. And real leadership sometimes involves standing up and saying, I am listening to the people who've elected me, and I'm going to respond to them.
On the particular circumstance we're talking about, the government's talking about incentive that they don't want to provide. If you do allow this family to stay, are you not encouraging a couple of things? One, for any family in this situation to get in a long legal battle, and the other one is to have children, that by allowing that family to stay, you do create a model.
Tom, I think you ought to listen to what you are suggesting there, is that somehow the Australian government should stop people from procreating. I don't think that's what you're suggesting there, but I think it's not an
that they should stop them procreating,
the Australian government would
make a decision. If you make a decision based on a family, and the main arguments are that they are a family, so they have children, and also that they've been here for a long time because of slower processing times, we're encouraging people to try to draw out the legal process, and as well that if they have children, that'll help them stay here.
Well, let's be clear here. What's drawing out the processes is the failure for the Department of Home Affairs to properly resource or manage visa processing times. The Auditor General has done a fairly significant and thorough report on this that made the point that the department doesn't even have the capacity to set timeframes or track complex and non-complex application processes, visa applications, citizenship applications. And quite frankly, that is part of the incompetence and maladministration that sits squarely with Peter Dutton.
The situation with this family, if they were allowed to stay, do you accept it's a zero-sum game? Another family wouldn't get in as a result?
No. No, that's not how the Migration Act works, Tom, and that's a furphy from the government. And can I also say that the government, who are conveniently out there today talking about a potential or an attempted boat arrival, because it suits them now to talk about on-water matters, despite the fact that Scott Morrison for years as Immigration Minister refused to talk about on-water matters, the government needs to be clear, one, if they're suddenly going to start reporting attempted boat arrivals. Two, will they talk about airplane arrivals as well and report on those? And three, acknowledge the fact that in this third-term Liberal government, since they were elected in 2013, there have been 35 attempts for boats to come. One actually arrived the very week that Peter Dutton sought to challenge Malcolm Turnbull for the top job. So the government have the responsibility here to be working in source countries to disrupt the people smuggling trade. And it is a highly manipulative act for them to be putting information out there today because they want to stem the public sympathy and support for this family.
But we don't have an endless number of people to come here. Every family you allow to come here makes it less likely for another one to come. That's pretty straightforward, isn't it?
But Tom, in this case, this would be a family allowed to stay here by the discretion that the minister has, the power the minister has under the Migration Act.
But again, there's so many cases that come across his desk every year.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and that is part of the responsibility for the minister to make decisions. What I'm saying with this family, and Tom, I feel we can go around all afternoon on this point, is this, that they have been allowed to stay here, they have been allowed to put down roots, they have done, as the Prime Minister says, they have had a go. No one could have asked them to have more of a go than integrating as they have into the Biloela community, and the Biloela community wants them to stay. This wouldn't be the first time discretion has been used in the Migration Act. I'm sure it won't be the last. And this is a simple decision that can put all of this cruelty and this heartbreak for the Biloela community at an end this afternoon.
Kristina, Keneally, appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you.